cannot tell you how incredibly proud I am and excited I am to be able to introduce our first contributor of the morning. Professor Alex McDowell holds the chair in the William Cameron Menzies Chair in the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts. That chair is endowed by George Lucas, just so you know. Alex is a raw designer for industry, and he runs, in my view, one of the most extraordinary institutions in the creative industries anywhere in the world, the World Building Lab in Los Angeles. A number of us were privileged to spend a couple of days there earlier in the year, and I have to tell you, it changed my life. So it's really extraordinary to be able to introduce Alex to the stage. He will explain some of these things in conversation with me, but he's a futurist, he's a design thinker, he's a storyteller. He sits extraordinarily in the intersection between emerging technology, experiential media, and some really extraordinary large-scale projects. Just so you know, he was the guy who designed Minority Report and spent 2 years in the process heading a team that designed the future that we all saw in Minority Report, which to some degree has conditioned the future we all now live in. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd love to welcome to the stage Professor Alex McDowell. Hey Alex, how are you?
Good, good. It's really not fair to ask a pseudo-American with an English accent to go on first with his jet lag. But
with your jet lag. So you are a Brit, aren't you? We should start there.
Yeah.
But you're based in LA. Shall we start talking about world building as an idea in the World Building Institute? We've got some slides that Alex may or may not refer to. I probably will a bit, I think, while we talk about this. But one of the reasons, apart from it's always a privilege to be anywhere near a stage you're on, for bringing you here, was to help us think about ways of thinking about the future. When you're conceiving of your work, when you're inventing your ideas, when you're framing possibility, I personally am a great believer that speculative fiction and world building actually helps us understand the present much more than many. It is not really about the future. So what's world building then, and how does it sit in the framework for thinking about the future?
Yeah, I think world building emerged out of me sort of falling off a series of cliffs through my career.
Right.
Driven really by the fact that I'm sort of intensely curious and easily bored. So I've moved forward, and after 30 years of film, actually Minority Report was the turning point. Really? Where I was forced to design a world because there was no script. So
there was literally no script. So it's sort of based on a Philip K. Dick story, but there was nothing when you started.
There was nothing, yeah.
Wow.
That's not strictly true. There was a half-page synopsis that Stephen had written.
Okay.
And really that was a provocation. It was Washington, D.C. 2050 and 3 precogs in the center as a disruptor. And the whole world really emerged from that provocation at the beginning.
Wow. And so the method for building the world then, how do you go about that? You sit in a room, put a towel over your head and write it with a pencil? I mean, what was the process?
No, it was driven by him, Steven Spielberg, asking a couple of things. One was that he wanted it to be future reality, not science fiction.
Okay.
And then to open the doors in the real world to go out and do sort of intense research, but not familiar in the film industry where you would tend to just huddle and read books, that we actually had to go and meet a lot of people out in the world.
Okay. So if I think back and I remember autonomous vehicles, I think I encountered as a concept for the first time in that movie, and personalized advertising, ads following Tom Cruise up an escalator, those sorts of things. How did that, who was talking about those things back in the day when you were thinking about that world?
Well, we were talking to architects, right. Greg Lynn and Frank Geary, for example, who were sort of at the front edge of architecture. In fact, we had to hire an architect into the art department because there was nobody in the film industry, in the art departments, who had the capability of designing buildings for the future, because they were basically drawing on a drawing board.
So do they have to work? They have to be true, these buildings?
They have to be conceived of as a natural progression from the present, I would say.
Okay.
And I think there's a big part of that, the architectural, which is you don't expect things to change dramatically. You know, we're still living in buildings that are 300, 400, 500 years old.
Yep.
But we have to have a sort of presence of new buildings. So architecture was one piece. But we also went out into MIT Media Lab. We went to Apple Labs. We went to DARPA, the military defense laboratories. And we had this access. It was a fantastic opportunity.
Right.
And our job was really to just ask questions. And those questions gave us clues. You know, we saw the first kind of 2-inch square of molecules of ink that could be magnetically or negatively attracted to the surface, which was essentially the basis of the Kindle.
Right.
But it was flexible, and we could imagine that that would become a surface. We saw sort of early Amazon, where it was, if you like this, you'll like that, and we posited that that was going to be the future of targeted advertising.
Right.
So we had all of these clues. The vertical car, the maglev car, came from just architects telling us that the height of buildings is constrained by the number of elevators that they can contain.
Oh.
So that kind of triggered a whole conversation between us, which was how might you increase the number of elevators to get this very tall city?
Right.
And what if they were on the outside of the building, and what if they could move intelligently around the building to where they were required, and also what if they were furniture? And the other piece was, how did Tom Cruise get to work in the morning? And so those two combined became an autonomous vehicle
right.
In year 2000. And so we've been sort of lauded in a way with the idea that Minority Report predicted the future in all of these ways. There's like 16 million hits on the web if you look that up.
Yeah.
But it was really not that we were really not being so clever. We were just listening carefully. And I think that's the fundamental part of research for us.
Is listening. And
Yeah.
did you conceive of it as world building to begin with? I think we need a clicker on stage, please, team. Did you conceive of it as world building as an idea? Did you think of it as that?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, laptop problem.
Excuse us, laptop unlocking in process. Now, can you all see my code?
I was sort of imagining you would look at it and it would automatically know your face. Was that just me?
Yeah, if only.
Yeah. Did you think of it as a paradigm of world building at that point? Had that become a notion that you were building a world?
No, I think we only really kind of took stock of that when the film came out.
Right.
2 years later, we went, hold on.
We've done
this
a
has
thing.
flipped the model, yeah.
Right. And that's then led you to the world building sort of frame of reference almost.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, so you've got some slides I think we could talk through about how that works for people who aren't familiar with the kind of methodology and the way of thinking. Is that a good thing for us to do?
A quick
do a little
kind
quick
of overview
of that. That'd be helpful. Okay, so it's coming up behind, but not on our monitors, this, I think.
But yeah, world building, the process really was us kind of taking stock, as I say, and reflecting back on how we had done it.
Right.
And then I was being asked to talk about it for a conference in Finland, and I was like, what am I going to talk about? And on the plane, I sketched out this kind of diagram of the nonlinear process that I think had come directly out of the questions we were asking, that we couldn't really do a linear process in a script-based way because there was no script.
Right.
We had to think about a holistic world. And that turned into...
Have we got this?
It's up here.
It's up here, but we can't see it.
But it's not up there. Okay.
They're working. So that turned into the idea of building a world. You and I, we talked about this a couple of times before, but that way of thinking feels quite theatrical to me. It feels, and that's obviously where I'm from, so sort of to me, in a way, everything is a nail. If you give me a theatrical hammer, I'll hit it. It feels like a rehearsal room. It feels like a kind of iterative process under which you build a piece of work that is more traditionally done in theatre that way. It's not really done in movies and TV in the same way. A little bit?
I think that what we discovered over, maybe in the first 7 years as we were kind of asking these questions, is that design transcends the silos, and that it's one of those, as somebody who's at least a designer in this through line of falling off cliffs, although Malcolm Garrett will attest to the fact that I was a lousy designer at the beginning of my career. I lost my thread. It's Malcolm's fault.
It probably is.
Yeah.
Many things are. Yes, it's a design process.
Right. So it's a design process, and I've been lucky to just be involved in a tiny bit of theatre, but it really opened my eyes to the fact that it is, you know, the way it evolves, the way it comes together through kind of an intuitive relationship between the major creators, kind of a jazz ensemble. It does resemble the front end of film as well.
The kind of writing and designing end?
Well, I think in the design space, I mean, there's an argument in a way about where writing comes, that I would still say that the script should at least be parallel to design or even after.
Right.
But you are in that completely improvisational space at the beginning of a film. There's nothing that a script tells the designer, really, other than what you're framing. You know, what are you going to be wrapping around the narrative and the actors? Right. But other than that, you really start from scratch.
So, in that process, then, the kind of the way you set out, the way you start the journey is really crucial. How you frame the question, how you frame where you're going to begin, because you don't know where you're going to end up, obviously, but how you set out feels very essential. Yeah. So you described that in Minority Report. So while we're dealing with the joy of HDMI cables or whatever's happening over there, in other worlds, because there have been many projects and you're still doing lots of them, really fascinating ones. How do you frame the essay question? How do you frame what the objectives are and what the parameters of the question are?
Well, I think it's a combination. I think that one listens carefully to the brief, you know, and then one rejects it completely.
Correct.
And starts to arrogantly sort of replace it with so you take the hint of it, but I think that it is our job as creative folks to challenge from the beginning, to create provocations, essentially. Our central provocation in world building is what if and why not. Right. So I think that's a challenge of any brief that comes in. But nevertheless, I think a brief is a seed, and you begin in this kind of low resolution, iterative process. And then as you increase resolution, so the narrative comes together. Right. I think that's the ideal. So you move from iteration to prototyping. Yep. That I would call design visualization, and then into an actually repetitive prototyping as you discover things. So
who's in the room then? Because I've been in a couple of days in your lab, and I think we've had this conversation. I'm a design process skeptic to some degree, except I found the process in your room extraordinarily enlightening and exciting. So how do you curate? I'm going to try and avoid the word curate because it's overused, but how do you cast the room? How do you ensure that there are so many points of view but not too many? How do you get the shared vocabulary to work in the room? Because these are hard things to do, aren't they?
They are. I think that, though, I don't think there can be too many people in the room.
There can't be too many. Okay.
Yeah. And if you do need to cast who they are in a way, because you're trying to gather knowledge. You're trying to become informed. You know, we start every project as the most ignorant people in the room, and so we have a lot to learn. And in order to learn what we need to create a holistic world, which is an essential part of this nonlinear process, the world we create interrogates itself in a way. There are millions of questions you have to ask. And in order to start filling that out, you need a range of experts. So they don't all have to be in the room at the same time. And I think there is a core design team that sets up the kind of basic research that allows you to understand what questions to ask. But then you have to gather people to that.
And so, I mean, that's both extraordinarily confident and really humble at the same time. You have to know you can lead, and you have to know you can shape, but you've also got to be willing to sit back and absorb and not try and control. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do, surely.
Well, I think that one of the things that we have found about world building, and it doesn't seem to have yet reached a sort of edge, is that when you start off asking questions and you do listen carefully, Whatever your intention was at the beginning, we've never yet, I think I've built about 70 worlds in the frame that we've been working. We've never yet had a world that turned out the way we intended, or anticipated, let's say. Because I think you don't, I mean, one of the problems I have now with clients when we're being paid to do commercial work is that we say, no, we can't tell you what you're going to get at the end.
Yeah.
And that's difficult to to get the client to gather to. But we've been able to do it by doing these kind of early prototypes and let them understand. But that's a big part of world building, is that the listening carefully is about the knowledge you need. And only as you gather knowledge do you even find out what medium you're working in. You know, we very much say that we're platform and media agnostic, because there's no, it would only constrain us.
So in the absence of your pictures, it looks like where we are, could you...
Which is just fine. Yeah.
Give us a couple of examples, which is fine, yeah. Give us a couple of examples of worlds you feel, you know, which you can explain without visualizing necessarily, but that you feel characterize the world building process, or that have been the most surprising projects you've been involved in? You know, because there's such a range. You're working with Ford at one end and the Inuit nation at the other, and I mean, these are not ends. That's the wrong way of describing it. But a huge range of kind of clients, collaborators, participants.
Yeah.
A couple of examples to just flesh it out a bit for us.
Well, if I would just talk about the projects we're engaged in right now.
Yeah.
Ford is one. We've been a couple of years with them. We're working with 2 indigenous tribes, or rather a whole number of tribes in Alaska, really, actually, for the whole tribal system. Okay. Their question was, how can their youth start looking towards the future? And the future's a huge part of what we're being asked to do now. We're working with the American Society of Engineers, civil engineers, right. Conceiving right now of 5 cities that are imagined 25 years out and 50 years out. We're working with the Alaska education system, so looking at the whole of higher education in Alaska, working directly with the president, who has a vision that he wants to express over the next 20 years. So how did that come about? What's the question you get asked? He was, I mean, it's kind of incestuous in that we don't go out and pitch work, really. We get sort of recommended by one to the other. And so in that case, the tribe, the Cook Inlet Tribal Council, invited the president, Jim Johnson, to one of our workshops. Right. And then as he saw that we were looking into the future, he said, what about looking into our future? So it was kind of that simple. But then we had to listen carefully to his vision, which is very, very well thought out, but involves a complete shift, because Alaska is actually very disadvantaged. There's a huge problem of getting high school students to move into higher education. Right. And so we did this, we are still doing, and we're right in the middle of it, looking at how there's a cyclical connectivity that doesn't really exist now from K-12 up through higher education, that train teachers that go back into K-12, but are being driven by the future of work. So the kind of industries that we do not yet know are going to evolve. We have to imagine that in 20 years they're going to have an enormous influence over what's being taught. And so we imagine completely new programs. Those programs, as I say, influence teachers, but everyone going out into industry. Right. Industry starts ingesting interns. That in turn changes the education system. So it's your foundation is systemic or systems thinking. I think systems design thinking. It's storytelling is the through line always. Yeah. But I think the framework within which the story exists is really important. So that's the systems piece. And that's the systems piece. So so that's really interesting. So I've seen some of the work with Ford, and that is kind of, it's huge in scope. How did that come about? And I think we might get some images in a moment, but what's the scope? How did that come about? How do you address a sort of client of that size at the same time as having the tool set to address the Alaskan indigenous nations? Well, again, we were very lucky that Jim Hackett, who's the current CEO, was supporting the conference that I ran for a few years, the World Building Conference. And he also had a vision, but and was finding it difficult to socialize within the company to some extent, which is, of course, a very traditional 100-year-old industry. And he is doing some revolutionary stuff, like saying Ford shouldn't necessarily build cars, which is relatively...
It's pretty revolutionary for a man who runs a car company, isn't it?
Yeah.
So he doesn't, actually, in a way, he doesn't think he does run an automobiles company anymore.
Well, I think he thinks that the evolution of, say, autonomous vehicles is going to have such a dramatic effect.
Right.
But it's mostly going to have a dramatic effect on cities.
Right.
And so our project is to look at the city of tomorrow, both from systems view, like how does the intelligent city interact with the intelligent, with smart mobility.
Right.
And so you can sort of see the wiring of that,
yes.
the kind of the connectivity that is coming, the sort of Internet of Things at city scale. But also what we're really interested in is the street level view, the human view. How does that giant system and that shifting city really affect the human? And actually how do people on the street make demands on that system?
Right.
Because they're more empowered. We are all more empowered than we've ever been.
Right. So, looks like we have access to this. I don't know if we have a clicker or whether...
I do.
You do?
Yeah.
So, assuming... let's see if that works. That would be amazing if it does.
And I'll talk... There's
and
a
then
couple
talk through... There are a couple of things in here
yeah.
about world building more generally, aren't there? And a couple of projects.
Yeah.
So let's just give you a few minutes to just do your thing.
I'll quickly mention, though, in relation to the Ford project, which is massive cities, I'm working in my research lab at the school, at USC, on a project that's about as far away from that as could be, which is designing a semantic language for the pancreatic betacell.
Right, that's not a sentence I expected to hear.
And I'm working with the pancreatic...
Unpack that a bit for me.
Our client is the Pancreatic Betacell Consortium, and who knew that there was a consortium.
They're a thing as well. Who knew there was a thing?
Exactly.
No, okay.
But the person leading that project is an amazing doctor, professor, who came to USC because of the School of Cinema. So he's an enormously successful medical, molecular biologist. And his premise is that what's missing from science is storytelling.
Right.
And so I had a conversation with him and asked him, what's the comparative scale between a pancreatic beta cell and its human equivalent? And he said, a single cell is about equivalent to a major city.
Okay.
And so we were kind of handed the metaphor, which was to say, well, in that case, what if we use the metaphor of cities that we intuitively understand, although it's an incredibly complex system. My young kids could go out in the city and work their way how to get around.
Right.
So we used that city metaphor and said, well, what if you use, what if it is a protein is a inhabitant or different scales of protein are inhabitants or architecture, and they work within an infrastructure, and there's cause and effect, and the delivering of messages, and there's a kind of context that you can begin to understand.
Right.
And then we developed a visual component, essentially a volumetric series of models that represented those moving parts, which actually turned out to be that origami was the common language between molecular biologists and architects, because both understood folding, essentially.
Okay. This is the bit where I do that thing my 12-year-old does and go,
But
okay,
it's
so
been an
origami and
process.
pancreatic beta cells.
Yeah,
Every
so-
time I meet you, you do something else that blows my mind.
But that's fascinating to us because it's it is creative, it is
clearly.
storytelling.
Yeah.
And it's a huge discovery on both sides, on the science side and the design, the art side, where we were looking at each other blankly for 6 months, going, how about this? How about that? And have no understanding of our
And
common
where did
language.
it come from? It came from sort of, it feels like it came from melting the boundary and just looking for the common shared.
I think that's a huge part of this. I think that creating platforms that allow people who do not speak each other's language to gather around a common space is kind of fundamental.
When I was in your lab, I found myself next to a philosopher, a statistician, a code genius, and somebody else, and somebody from the sort of quasi sort of movie side, but who wasn't in any way a movie person.
Yeah.
And it was extraordinarily fascinating to meet those people. And then you set a question that, again, was entirely, well, not even, you didn't set a question. We explored a question which made us all think we were slightly off kilter and all look for a way of sort of balancing together. And about 4 hours in, we were doing it. Yeah. And I thought that was an extraordinary thing to be able to pull off with this range of people, many of whom were experienced or expert in their areas.
Yeah.
And so melting the sort of shell of expertise, the sort of shell of, not lack of collaboration, but the difficulty of being open is something that the way you all went about it was really phenomenally successful at for me. And I think it came from the thinking. I don't know if it's worth looking at the model to some extent, how you think about it, this sort of reflexive systems way you think, which I think was fascinating. This diagram I've seen before. And is it visible from up there? Yes, it is.
Yeah. I mean, I can skim through this. This is a very stupid, simplified version of storytelling, but I think it speaks to the point, which is that storytelling was initially designed to make sense of the world around us. It evolved because there was a need to explain the unexplainable. Those things in the shadows, that silver disc crossing the sky that turns into a princess in a chariot, and the metaphors that evolved from that were fundamentally survival systems. So first of all, they were the product of a collective knowledge, a collective gathering of knowledge to make sense of the world, and then formed a language and a system to be able to pass that knowledge down through generations, where it was added to and it was cumulative and evolutionary. And that was a fantastic sort of oral tradition, which still exists in many indigenous tribes, but completely got lost in the West when Gutenberg slammed the printing press down in front of us, and everything became author-driven, essentially. So we've suffered, to some extent, 600 years of waiting to be told, sitting in the audience with a proscenium relationship to the creator or to the author. And, in this diagram, you kind of go through the artist, the author, the designer, the auteur, the director, the star architect. All of those are people who've been put in a position of expertise, the sort of top of the pyramid. And what was really interesting for us is the first project I was given, having come into USC as this kind of notion of a world builder, was Intel coming in and asking us in a research space to challenge their chips, to build something that was going to fundamentally shift their thinking around the next evolution of the chip, of computation. And so we had come into the 2012 relatively early investigation around the mixed reality tools. Sure. And stepping inside VR immediately required us to think different about storytelling. Right. And it was really clear that Sleep No More was a much better analogy. Theater was a much better analogy or a much better framework for storytelling within the world-building space for mixed reality than cinema or TV or any of the linear screen-based media. And so we're still looking really for ways to evolve the kind of storytelling that can and should exist in a holistic world space, in a spherical world, which is essentially what VR is. Yeah. We look at jazz, for example, where there is no single author, where it's completely intuitive, instinctive, evolutionary. That's much closer to the process. And so world building really got honed into a multiply influenced, multi-storyteller space, which to my mind kind of takes the circle back to tribal. That we've moved and we are now in the evolution of tribal storytelling, and it's not even an evolution because it's really looking back at the the history to global narrative and to tribal storytelling again.
Right.
And I think world building becomes this space. It's kind of a base of research and knowledge gathering, but it becomes knowledge transfer in the same way as passing stories through generations.
Right. So there's a sort of celebration of complexity in a lot of your work. And sort of, the notion that there is a simple authorial position. It's still very interesting in other areas, but in another context, both of us and differently have worked with one of the great cinematic world-building authors in Terry Gilliam. And if you work with Terry, you're working in a world all the time, which is a world that's somewhere in the back of Terry's head. But when those sort of creatives operate in, say, theatre in my case, or they tend to bring what they're used to. They tend to bring that kind of authorial linearity or that precision, which is important in those disciplines, but be less interested in the complexity of circular storytelling, the complexity of systems, because it isn't really where they've sort of cut their teeth.
Yeah.
So how do you merge? Do you merge? I mean, you've other things in here about the prototype, so we'll come back to the question. But world building is a tool set. It's a way of approaching questions. It's not a team, is it? I feel like I'm slightly an alumnus from a couple of days of the idea, without being part of a. I'm not part of a cult or anything.
Yeah.
It's a way of thinking.
It is, and it's a way of thinking that's completely enabled by what's happening now. So we're in this maybe the most disruptive period in history in terms of how little we know about what's ahead of us, and yet how much we know about the capability of it changing.
Right.
So on the whole, the people we work with are people who understand that things are changing to such an extent that they cannot begin to predict what's going to happen to them.
Right.
And so this kind of idea that when everything is changing, the uncertainty, the chaos, if you like, which is where we thrive as creatives, enables us to really break the model and start thinking about how you, for example, in a collaborative, collective, sort of socialist world space of thinking completely differently, how you can actually prototype the future. Whether it's 10, 15, 20, 50 years out, there is a kind of natural evolution of thinking when it's completely embedded in present reality or history. We're dealing with an arc of time. The future doesn't exist alone, as you were saying. It's the historical context is really important.
Right.
So delving deeply into the kind of research process which involves all of these questions we ask of the experts, whether they are academics or high school students who are equally expert and probably more so than most adults, that all of those people bring to the table the solutions to something that individually they couldn't begin to predict.
And then you kind of instantiate and you prototype and you test and you develop. And that's clearly, that has become, over the last decade or so, that's become the way we think about artistic and commercial and creativity, in a way it sort of wasn't in the auteur model, the sort of suffering in a garret with a gitan sort of post-romantic art model. Yeah. This is an inherently collaborative way of thinking, and inherently complex. It is a complex way of running your life. Yeah. We are slightly surrounded by people who are suggesting that there are simplicities and ways of running the world that are not complex, and that it is we can reduce things to binaries, etc.
I think it's impossible to tell stories now in that way, actually. We've been conditioned in the same way as we were conditioned by the single author. We were conditioned by a Victorian industrial process that was linear, that passed the knowledge down and it expected it to be adapted by disconnected series of people on the production line. And it's completely irrelevant now, I think. I mean, the biggest enemies we all have are PowerPoint and Excel, really.
Well, we found that just earlier on.
Yeah.
Well, it's extraordinary.
Excel, the spreadsheet kills the creative process because it doesn't correspond in any way to the way we think. It's entirely linear.
Right.
And so some of these things, need to be disrupted fundamentally. But in the meantime, the shift, I think, and as we start collaborating across silos, specifically in the arts science space, where there's a real interesting tension that can, pull stories out that have never existed.
Right.
That's only possible if you have artists and scientists. So but also I think it elevates is the wrong word, but I think the creative process that have been considered, the artist in the garret, the kind of, crazy, unpredictable individual types, is completely not true. I mean, I think artists for the last 1,000 years have understood quantum physics fundamentally, for example. Picasso was dealing with quantum.
Go on, unpack that a bit. How is Picasso dealing with quantum?
I think that it's the idea of a simultaneity of viewpoints for existence,
right.
or the ability to imagine simultaneous events through time, distributed across time. I think that therefore, I think that the creative is more as useful to the scientist in that case, because we have so we kind of have to bring the creative process into that idea of balance, and not these crazy folks over here, but that we do work within complex systems.
Right.
We always have.
Right.
And those complex systems are incredibly important, and that art now, actually the creative process, and I think this is what's so great about what you're doing, drives the future of engineering and technology because it makes demands on it.
Right.
And I think now we're sort of in a space where we can think about that. And so this idea of us being fundamentally disruptive is really about that what if, why not challenge.
Right.
And yeah.
Have you got a couple of other things here?
Yeah, I'll go quickly here. So this is the sort of idea of a container of narrative. And this is sort of fundamental to the research process, to the idea that, and I'll just work the way through it, we start off as we develop a world in this mandala space, which is basically a slice through a sphere, and is asking questions around all of the parts. As we start off in scale, so the outer line is context, how the where are we, where are we, when are we?
Right.
The difference between being on Mars or in 16th century Paris, the context completely changes storytelling. And then we move through the metaphors of the city, the neighborhood, the street corner, the group or the family, all the way through to the individuals. So this is, this is a blank screen. Hang on. That's interesting. Oh, here we go. So we occupy this space with these kind of high-level ecologies, and each of these is necessary to storytelling. It always has been, really. But how do you understand the world in terms of what energies does it need to receive? How is it governed? What is its infrastructure? How does it evolve culturally? And as you move through to the center of the space where the individual resides, in terms of scale, you have contextualized the narrative around that one or many individuals. Mm-hmm. And then you push them back out into the world, and they start demanding their own questions. So these can be meta characters, but you have to solve the framework of the world around them.
I see.
And so the storytelling, the high level of those ecologies doesn't change very much. Those questions are fundamental and high level. But as the character moves back through all of these tiny, illegible black and white words, adapt completely to the kind of story that's being told.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely makes sense. So it's a map of competencies, capabilities, challenges. It's a way of describing the entire landscape, and then your kind of lenses are on the side. Lenses will be familiar to many of us from sort of game design theory as much as anything else, and broader user-centric design theory. But this brings lenses into a sort of very holistic context, which I think is unusual. I don't think I've seen it apart from in your work. I haven't seen it represented in this way. That may be that I haven't seen it. Who do you look to challenge you? Because, I mean, you spend a great amount of time doing wonderfully exciting and challenging projects, but, what do you read? Who do you meet? where do you find your inspiration and challenge? Because we've 4 or 5 minutes to go. And I want to know
okay.
more about
Yeah.
sort of where you get your fuel from.
Well, I think because we start ignorant, it's actually everybody. You know, when we do this project that we've been running called the Street Corner, where we're trying to find the microcosm of the city, then we gather people and ask them, you know, what is their memory of a street corner, for example, and each of the people in the room are the world's leading expert on their own street corner, and they're always surprising. You know, every person that comes to the table is delivering information that we don't necessarily know, and certainly the others around the table don't know. And so you're constantly getting this idea of surprising one another, provoking one another. And that in turn, I mean, that's why I think the multiple author, the holistic world combined with any number of authors is so powerful. If you take that, first of all, the ingestion of knowledge and the research and development base.
Right.
And then as you move it out into the world, the demands it makes on your knowledge is provocative and evolutionary, and it really does solve problems. And the center of that is fiction. So this is the other tricky thing when we deal with commercial clients, is saying, actually, fiction is the way we're going to move all of this
right.
forward. But it's not futurism, and it's not following trends or scenario building so much. It's really saying, where would you like to be? On what horizon would you like to see yourselves? And then often moving towards an aspirational future, almost never dystopian.
Right.
But creating this world out there and then thread it back to the present and use that to redirect your intent from the present towards it.
And people can take their own ownership then of that process and take it where they wish.
Yeah, very often you're really giving them the tools just to take it from there on
So
out.
you've been extraordinarily helpful to us in the Clusters programme and in the wider Audience of the Future programme, and the Audience of the Future programme as well, and you're specifically engaged with us in Future Screens NI. So you're just, there's going to be a world building project as part of the Clusters programme? Is it going to come from Belfast? What's going to happen?
Yeah, well, I can't help myself, you know, it just turns into, some way or other, it always turns into world building. But yeah, the Ulster project is fascinating, and working with that team, with Paul, and you know, kind of dealing with incredibly sensitive and complicated issues, historical, present, and how to project into the future, and how do you create new relationships and new ways of people, not just in the creative process of gathering around and collaborating, but how does that become something that's infecting the next people who engage. The really important experts are the participants who you're, you know, or the people who inhabit the world that you're actually dealing with. So we're doing a project at school now at the USC looking at the future of Skid Row, which I don't know if is a known space, but probably the biggest concentration and the longest space of homelessness. So in the center of LA, you know, 20 minutes away from the middle class, kind of very wealthy USC, is impoverished homelessness to the extent that it falls way below the UN's bottom line for refugee camps. So how do you engage a community like that and ask them to think about a 15-year future is a very delicate process.
Absolutely.
And it involves, you know, trust, but the storytelling is inherently inside that relationship.
So I could talk to you all day and learn in every sentence. So we've come to the end of our slot. You're staying around, I think, all day. So Alex staying around all day. It's wonderful to meet somebody who can stretch from a commercial activity with Ford about the future of cities to Skid Row and Northern Ireland and interesting projects where we're looking at social value and cultural value as well as in the commercial side. But it all sits on the way you think about it, doesn't it? It all sits on this set of tools.
I think so. And this in turn is driven by every group of experts who comes to it. And that's the fundamental thing, is that it's really just this container, this shell that has context, is holistic, demands that one thinks about all of the aspects of the world, but only gets populated by the people who are deeply engaged in its outcome.
Alex, you're always extraordinarily inspiring, and you're immensely generous with your time and your expertise. We're out of time, I'm afraid, but can we express our thanks for Professor Alex McDowell?